What if a cold-hearted CEO and a clumsy barista collided over a cookie, and everything changed? In a rainy corner of Seattle, where secrets brew stronger than coffee, one simple act of kindness sparks a chain of events that threatens million-dollar deals, and just maybe opens the door to something far more dangerous: love. But behind every smile, there's a secret. And behind every perfect latte, a moment that could ruin everything. Want more twists, tension, and heart-melting moments? Subscribe to our YouTube channel now and don't miss a single chapter of this slow burn, high-stakes love story. Your next obsession starts here. The morning rush at the cozy mug had just begun. The warm scent of freshly baked croissants and espresso floated through the air as the door chimed softly, letting in the ever-present drizzle of Seattle rain. Piper Sweet, sleeves rolled up and a dusting of flour on her cheek, was balancing a tray full of her signature smiley face cookies, fresh out of the oven. Her focus was split between the tray and a small notepad where she doodled an idea for a new tart recipe. Just as she rounded the counter, her foot caught the edge of the rug, and the tray tipped. "No, no, no," she gasped. In a flurry of clattering metal and sugary chaos, the tray slipped from her hands. Cookies tumbled onto the tiled floor like cheerful little soldiers gone rogue. One, almost perfectly intact, spun dramatically across the cafe floor like a hockey puck, straight toward the front door. At precisely that moment, Jackson Riley, tall, tailored, and terrifying in the most CEO-ish way, pushed the door open. His phone was at his ear, a Bluetooth earpiece tucked in, and his expression was as unreadable as ever. His polished leather shoe stopped the rogue cookie in its path. Piper's heart dropped, of all the people. She rushed over, mortified, brushing her hair behind her ear as she crouched down to scoop up the cookie. "I'm so sorry, sir," she blurted out. "I swear they usually stay on the tray. That one just had a mind of its own, I guess." Jax looked down, first at the cookie, then at her. His face remained unreadable for a moment too long. Then, without saying a word, he gave a subtle nod and stepped aside, continuing toward his usual table in the back corner. Piper stood there for a second longer than necessary, replaying the moment in her head and silently cursing gravity. Behind the counter, Sarah, her co-worker and unofficial gossip queen of the cafe, leaned over and whispered, "Did he just not yell at anyone? That's new." "I think I broke him," Piper whispered back, half joking, half mortified. Minutes passed. Piper had gathered the rest of the cookie casualties, replaced the tray, and wiped down the floor. She tried to go back to work like nothing had happened, but out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement at Jax's table. He was looking out the window as usual, phone now placed on the table beside his black coffee. But then, just before he reached for the cup, something shifted in his face. He smiled. It wasn't wide or obvious, just a subtle tug at the corner of his mouth, barely there, almost like he was trying not to, but Piper saw it. And so did Sarah. "Oh my God," she hissed, eyes wide. "Did he just smile because of the cookie, because of you?" I don't know," Piper murmured, stunned. But for the first time since she'd started working at the cozy mug, Piper felt like she might have cracked the surface of Seattle's coldest regular. Piper Sweet arrived in Seattle with a second-hand suitcase, a spiral-bound recipe book smudged with flour, and a heart full of hopeful determination. Raised in a tiny town where the postman knew your dog's name and everyone brought pie to church picnics, Piper grew up in the comforting scent of cinnamon rolls and vanilla extract. She dreamed of one day owning her own bakery with a garden out back, somewhere quiet, warm, and welcoming, where people could sip coffee, eat something sweet, and forget the world outside for a while. With her blonde ponytail always a little messy and flour often dusting her cheeks, she was sunshine wrapped in an apron, hopelessly earnest and maybe a little out of place in a city like Seattle. Jackson Riley, on the other hand, was everything Piper was not. Young, Sharp and relentlessly successful, Jax was the kind of man who ran his company with military precision and negotiated real estate deals worth millions before most people had their first coffee. He wore custom suits, drove silent electric cars, and rarely looked up from his phone unless something, or someone, demanded his full attention. Behind the curated polish was a man under pressure, driven by expectations and haunted by a past he never discussed. To most, he was untouchable, unreadable, just another powerful man in a fast-moving city. They would never have met, should never have collided, except for the cozy mug, a warm little corner of the world where the city's rain slowed down and the coffee always smelled like home. And in that quiet place, where Piper made cookies with smiley faces and Jax always sat in the same corner without a word, two opposite worlds quietly began to bend toward each other. Piper had a theory, one that made perfect sense in her head, even if it might have sounded ridiculous out loud. She was convinced that the tall, silent man in the corner, who never smiled and always looked like he had the weight of the world on his shoulders, simply needed a hug. But since hugging a stranger in a $5,000 suit was probably a bad idea, she found another way: cookies. Every morning after preparing the pastries and setting up the counter, Piper would slip a single smiley face cookie onto a small plate and hand it off with Jax's usual black coffee. No charge, no explanation, just a warm, buttery grin and a tiny handwritten note. Hope today is kinder than yesterday. Or some smiles are edible, like this one. The first time, Jax raised an eyebrow, looked at the cookie like it was a foreign object, and set it aside without a word. The second time, he glanced at the note, then tucked it into his laptop bag. By the third day, he accepted it without protest. He never asked for them, never said thank you, but Piper noticed he always finished the cookie. And while he still looked like a man negotiating billion-dollar mergers with a permanent scowl, something in his posture started to shift, just barely. His shoulders eased, his brows furrowed a little less. Once, she even caught the ghost of a smile when he read her note that said, "Even CEOs need carbs." It was small, silly even. But Piper believed in the quiet power of small things, and slowly so did he. One rainy Tuesday, instead of his usual curt, "Black coffee, no sugar," Jax paused at the counter, eyes flicking up to meet Piper's. "I'll try a latte today," he said, almost like he wasn't sure of the words, "with oat milk and cinnamon." Piper blinked, surprised. "Really? I mean sure, absolutely, coming right up." As she steamed the milk, she couldn't help but smile to herself. It was the first time he'd deviated from his routine in weeks, maybe months, maybe ever. When she handed him the cup, she added a little cinnamon heart on the foam. He didn't comment on it, but he didn't scrape it off either. The next day, he ordered a cappuccino. The day after that, a flat white. Then a chai latte for research, he claimed, eyes flickering with something dangerously close to amusement. Piper started to look forward to his questions. What's the difference between a macchiato and a cortado? Do people really drink matcha? She answered everyone like he was a curious kid instead of a hard-edged CEO. In her mind, he wasn't just trying new drinks. He was learning to slow down, to breathe a little. She even teased him one morning, handing him a frothy drink with a wink. "Careful, Jax. At this rate, you'll be journaling and meditating by next week." He smirked, the kind of subtle, sideways grin that made her stomach flutter a little. "Maybe, if you teach me." Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew these drinks weren't just drinks anymore. They were excuses to stand a little longer, speak a little softer, and linger in each other's orbit just a little more each day. One morning, as Piper handed over his coffee, this time a mocha with just the right amount of whipped cream, Jax lingered by the counter instead of heading straight to his usual table. He looked down at the smiley face cookie she'd tucked beside the cup and said, almost offhandedly, "You know, I actually don't like cookies." Piper blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, seriously, but you always eat them." Jax shrugged. Habit maybe, or maybe you guilt me into it with those ridiculous faces. He picked up the cookie and held it between two fingers. This one smiling at me like it knows all my secrets. Piper laughed unabashed. That's the goal, sugar-based emotional therapy. He gave her a look, dry, amused, but not unkind. You've got a very unusual approach to customer service. I aim to please, she said, then leaned on the counter a bit. Besides, I'm practicing. One day I'm going to open my own bakery, not just a little shop either. I want a garden out back. Vines on the walls, string lights everywhere, cats sleeping in sunbeams. I'll serve cinnamon rolls the size of your face. Jack stared at her, blinking once, twice. Then, completely without warning, he laughed, a short, surprised sound like something he hadn't meant to let out. It was the first time she'd heard it, and she could tell from his face. It was the first time in a long time he'd heard it, too. He cleared his throat, sounds peaceful. It will be, Piper said, smiling. You can even come sit in the garden and grumble at your emails. He shook his head, still smiling faintly. You're very strange. Thank you, she beamed. I take that as a high compliment. And somehow, just like that, a wall began to crack. A little cookie, a little dream, and a little laugh that neither of them expected. It happened late one morning when the cafe was quieter than usual and the rain outside had softened into a gentle mist. Jack stood at the counter, waiting for a lavender latte Piper had talked him into trying. She was humming as she sprinkled dried petals on top, and out of nowhere she asked, "If you weren't a real estate mogul, what would you be?" Jax blinked. "Excuse me." She glanced up. "I mean, what did you want to be? You know, before the suits and the deals and the phone permanently glued to your hand." He hesitated visibly, almost awkwardly, then let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "A chef." Piper's eyes lit up. "Wait, seriously, like, cook in a restaurant chef?" "I had this plan," he said, voice quieter than usual, almost thoughtful. "I was going to go to culinary school. I used to sneak into the kitchen at night and try out recipes when I was a kid. I was obsessed with French sauces for a while." She grinned. "Of course you were. You look like someone who'd have strong opinions about béarnaise." Jax gave a soft laugh. "Yeah, well, my father didn't think sautéing shallots was a viable career path. Told me if I wanted to play with food, I could do it after I got an MBA, so I shelved the dream. Permanently." Piper set the latte down gently in front of him, her voice a little softer now. "That's kind of heartbreaking." He shrugged, but the way he looked down at the cup said it hurt more than he admitted. "Life happens. I like where I am, most days." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "You know, if you ever want to learn how to make cookies shaped like dinosaurs or scones that look like clouds, I give great lessons." Jax looked up at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, part regret, part curiosity, part maybe. "Don't tempt me," he said, but there was a warmth to his voice that hadn't been there before. And from that moment, Piper saw him a little differently. Not just the polished CEO, but the boy who once dreamed of chopping onions for a living. Their conversations became a quiet rhythm, woven into the mornings like the smell of fresh coffee and the hum of jazz playing through the speakers. It wasn't always deep or meaningful. Sometimes it was just small talk, whether coffee beans, why someone would willingly drink decaf, but it was consistent, comfortable. Piper started noticing little things about Jax, how he always arrived exactly 2 minutes before 8, how he rotated between 3 suits but always wore the same watch, how his eyebrows did a barely their twitch whenever she surprised him with a new drink. He was still buttoned up, still very much CEO mode, but there was a dry humor behind his comments now, a flicker of mischief that hadn't been there before. She teased him once, said he looked like he was about to walk into a boardroom even when he was just ordering a muffin. "Old habits," he replied, smirking, "and don't act like you're not judging me while covered in flour." "I'm not judging," Piper said, brushing powdered sugar off her sleeve. I'm observing there's a difference." He chuckled, shaking his head, and she thought, there it is again. That almost smile, that softness trying to break through. Jax, for his part, had no idea how he ended up talking to a barista about scones and snail-shaped brioche every morning. But he kept coming back, not because he needed caffeine, though he did, but because Piper was unpredictable, earnest, unfiltered in a way that felt dangerously honest in a world built on polished facades. He told himself he was just being polite, that it was fine to indulge a conversation or two. But deep down, Jax knew there was something about her that disarmed him, and for a man who built his life on control, that was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. It started with a guy named Trevor. He was a regular, early 30s graphic designer type, all vintage denim and easy smiles. Piper had always been friendly to everyone, but that morning, Jax noticed something different. Trevor lingered longer at the counter. Piper laughed a little louder, and when Trevor asked if she'd maybe want to grab a drink sometime, Jax, seated in his usual corner, felt something unpleasant twist in his stomach. Piper didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She smiled, sweet, polite, and said she'd think about it. Jax took a slow sip of his cappuccino and didn't react. Then he ordered a second one. And 15 minutes later, a third, an oat milk latte this time, which he didn't even like. Piper blinked. "You okay? That's a lot of caffeine for someone who usually drinks like one bitter cup of capitalism." He shrugged, cool as ever. "Rough morning." She handed him the drink with a curious look, noticing the unusually crisp $20 bill he left on the tip jar without so much as glancing back. Jax, you forgot your change." He paused mid-step, then said over his shoulder, "Keep it, for the emotional damage of having to watch whatever that guy just tried." Piper stared after him, stunned, a grin creeping onto her face. So he had been paying attention. And somewhere in the back of the cozy mug, Jax sat back down, stared into his untouched latte, and told himself that what he felt wasn't jealousy. It was quality control. Obviously, it happened on a Friday, when the sky couldn't decide between drizzle and downpour. Piper wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and leaned over the counter toward Jax, who was sipping a flat white and pretending not to glance at her every 30 seconds. "Hey," she said, casual but a little mischievous, "you ever had a cruffin that changed your life?" Jax raised an eyebrow. What now?" "A cruffin, croissant plus muffin, magic plus carbs." She tilted her head. "I know a place, tiny bakery, hard to find, smells like heaven, you in?" He hesitated. There were meetings, calls, emails waiting. But then again there was Piper, eyes lit up like a dare. "Lead the way." They walked 3 blocks, umbrellas forgotten, feet splashing through puddles. The bakery was tucked behind a bookstore, with fogged-up windows and handwritten signs. Piper ordered 2 cruffins and made Jax try one before he could overthink it. "It's unnecessarily good," he admitted between bites, powdered sugar clinging to his tie. "I know," she beamed. They sat by the window, watching the rain blur the city. She talked about pastries, Paris, and the cat she'd name Croissant if she ever adopted one. He told her about his first failed omelet at age 9, and the scar on his finger from trying to flambe without supervision. On the walk back, the rain turned heavier. Piper laughed and spun in a circle, arms wide. Jax tried to look unimpressed, failed completely, and followed her into the downpour. By the time they reached the cafe, both were soaked, dripping and breathless with laughter. Piper looked at him, water clinging to his lashes, his hair a little wild, and said, "You should smile like that more often." Jax didn't answer, he just smiled wider. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't care that his phone had 20 missed calls. That afternoon, the rain had finally let up, and a soft golden light poured through the windows of the cozy mug. The cafe was quieter than usual, just a few regulars chatting softly over their drinks. Piper was wiping down a table near the window when Mr. Harris walked in, an older man with kind eyes, a well-worn notebook, and the kind of air that made people think he was someone's favorite uncle. Piper liked him. He always tipped well, asked how her day was going, and talked about the neighborhood like it was a living, breathing character in a novel. "Afternoon, Miss Piper," he said cheerfully, still baking happiness into every muffin. She grinned, trying my best. As she poured his usual Earl Grey, 2 sugars, he made a casual remark about the development rumors near the waterfront. "Been hearing whispers," he said. "Something big's about to happen down there. You hear anything through the grapevine?" Piper, still glowing from her rainy day bakery adventure with Jax, didn't hesitate. "Oh, yeah, actually this morning Mr. Riley was talking about it on the phone. Something about finalizing the deal before competitors catch wind, and I think he said they're going to revamp the whole block. Sounds exciting, right? The city could use something fresh." She smiled as she handed him the tea, not noticing the way Harris's eyes sharpened just slightly, his pen already moving across a napkin. "Interesting," he murmured, still friendly. "Very exciting indeed." Piper didn't think anything of it. Why would she? Mr. Harris had always struck her as a harmless old man who loved scones and local gossip. It wasn't until much later, after the article went live, after the phone calls started pouring in, after Jax's team realized their competitors had somehow gotten wind of their most sensitive deal, that she remembered that conversation. And by then, the damage was already done. The news hit like a storm. Within hours of the article going live, whispers turned into headlines. Blogs, forums, and business networks were all buzzing about Riley and Co.'s imminent acquisition of the waterfront property, a deal that, until now, had been locked behind layers of confidentiality agreements and strategic silence. And then, as if on cue, Jax's biggest competitor swooped in with a counteroffer. Faster, louder, public. His phone didn't stop ringing. Legal was in panic mode. Investors were calling for emergency updates. The owner of the property, the one Jax had been carefully negotiating with for weeks, suddenly started considering other options. The worst part wasn't just the leak. It was how it had leaked. Someone had spoken, someone inside or close enough to know exact phrasing, exact intent. His team was airtight, his lawyers even more so. So who the hell had talked? Jax couldn't sit still, couldn't breathe in his glass-walled office with everyone's eyes darting toward him. His gut burned with frustration, betrayal, and something that felt a little too much like disbelief. His car turned toward the cozy mug before he even realized what he was doing. The moment he stepped through the door, the cafe felt smaller than usual, warmer, quieter. Piper was behind the counter, humming to herself as she organized the pastry case, completely unaware of the hurricane she'd helped unleash. Jack stood there for a second, heart pounding, jaw clenched. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla felt oddly out of place in the chaos of his mind. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Hey, you're early today, I was just—" He didn't smile back. "Piper," he said, his voice lower than usual, controlled but tight, "can I ask you something?" The warmth drained from her face almost instantly. Something in his tone, in his eyes, told her this wasn't about coffee. "Yeah," she said, voice small. "Of course, what's wrong?" Jack stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "This morning," he said, "did you happen to talk to anyone about the waterfront project?" Piper's smile faltered. Her hands froze above a tray of cookies. And just like that, the storm began to close in. Piper's fingers tightened around the edge of the pastry tray as Jax's question hung in the air, heavier than any silence she'd ever known. "I what?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jax didn't blink. "Did you talk to anyone, Mr. Harris, maybe, about what I said this morning, about the waterfront?" Her heart dropped. Oh no, she breathed. Jax, I didn't mean to. He just asked about the neighborhood and I thought it was public knowledge already and… He didn't raise his voice. That made it worse. So you told him, Jax said flatly. The deal, the timeline, the strategy, you just gave it away. I didn't know, she said quickly, eyes wide with panic. I swear I didn't realize it was private. He's just this sweet old guy with a notebook. I didn't think he'd… He's a journalist, Jax cut in, sharper now. It's literally his job to sniff out anything people aren't supposed to say. Piper's breath caught. Her eyes were already glassy, her hands trembling. I thought I was helping. I thought I was proud of you, of what you were doing. I didn't know it could hurt you. There was a pause, one of those awful, stretching silences where 100 things could be said, but none of them felt right. Jax looked at her then, not with anger exactly, but with something deeper, something like disappointment. Or heartbreak. His voice softened, but it didn't ease. You didn't ask, you didn't think, you just talked. That was the breaking point. Piper's lips parted, but no words came out. Her shoulders curled inward as tears spilled over, silent and immediate. She covered her mouth as if she could somehow take it back, swallow the words, undo everything. I'm so sorry, she whispered through sobs. Jax, I'm so sorry. He didn't respond. He just stared at her, this girl who'd smiled at him every morning, who'd cracked open something in him he hadn't even realized was sealed shut, and then turned away. No dramatic exit, no slammed door. Just a man walking out of a cafe, leaving behind the warmth he didn't know he'd started to need. The cozy mug felt quieter without him. Piper tried to go about her shifts as usual, pouring coffee, serving pastries, laughing with customers, but something inside her felt muted. She still baked the muffins, the croissants, the sticky buns, but the smiley face cookies, she couldn't bring herself to shape a single one. Not after that night, not after the look he gave her, that awful silence. Still, every morning at 6 a.m., she found herself standing at the workbench in the back, hands dusted in flour, staring at an empty baking sheet. Her heart and head argued every day. Don't do it. But what if? And so, despite everything, she made one. Just one smiley face cookie, carefully frosted, slightly imperfect, and slid it into a small paper bag. No note, no flourish, just the cookie. She didn't tell anyone. At exactly 7:30, she walked 3 blocks through the morning fog to the tall glass building with Riley & Co.'s name etched on the front. Her hands trembled as she placed the bag gently at the base of the door, right where he'd be sure to see it on his way in. Then she turned and left before anyone could spot her. Meanwhile, across the city, Jax had barely spoken in days. Meetings passed in a blur. His team danced around him carefully, sensing the storm he carried in his silence. But when he got to the office that morning, something stopped him. A small, plain paper bag. He bent down slowly, pulling it open, and there it was. That stupid little cookie, smiling up at him like nothing had changed, like it still believed in him. Jack stared at it for a long moment. He didn't smile, he didn't eat it. But he carried it with him all day. The next morning, the bag was there again. Same spot, same quiet offering, but this time when Jax opened it, something else fell out alongside the cookie. A small, folded piece of paper, torn from the corner of a notepad, the handwriting unmistakably Piper's. Soft, round letters that looked like they belonged on a cafe chalkboard. I've learned that kindness isn't enough, not without thought behind it. I want to grow, I want to be better. Because I want to be someone worth standing next to you. Jax read it once, then again. The paper was slightly smudged, like maybe she'd rewritten it a few times before settling on those words. He didn't realize he was smiling until his assistant walked in and froze, mid-report. Is that a cookie? Jax slid the note into his wallet and stood, already reaching for his coat. Push my meetings. I'll be back in an hour. Back at the cozy mug, Piper was wiping down the counter, trying to focus, trying not to look at the door every time it chimed. She told herself not to hope. Then it opened, and he walked in. Soaking wet from the drizzle, suit slightly wrinkled, and a look in his eyes she hadn't seen in days. He stepped up to the counter, didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. Then quietly, "Do you have any of those ridiculous cookies left?" Piper blinked, then broke into a teary, stunned laugh. "Only the ones with extra frosting." Jax leaned in a little. "Good, I think I'm ready for something sweet." Their first official date wasn't fancy. Just a late afternoon walk through a quiet park with 2 cups of coffee and a shared cinnamon roll between them. But it felt monumental. No secrets, no tension, just the two of them side by side with the city buzzing quietly in the background. From that day on, it became real. They started carving out time for each other in ways that felt deliberate. Jax, once glued to a calendar booked out for months, now left Friday evenings open without telling his assistant why. Piper, who used to plan her life by instinct and a sprinkle of chaos, now kept a little planner in her apron pocket, penciling in time for real meals and taxes, at Jax's gentle encouragement. He taught her how to think long-term, how to structure a business proposal, how to build a financial model for her future bakery, how to say no without apologizing. She soaked it all in, eager and determined, notebook always in hand. In return, she showed him how to breathe, how to eat slowly, how to laugh at small things, how to watch clouds move without wondering if they'd delay a deal. She dragged him to bookstores, taught him how to fold croissant dough. "Don't fight it, Jax, just let the butter guide you," and once even convinced him to bake an entire batch of lemon bars on a Sunday afternoon. His turned out awful. He was furious. She kissed flour off his nose and told him she loved the effort more than the taste. Together they created a strange, beautiful balance. Ambition meeting wonder, structure meeting spontaneity. They weren't perfect, but they were learning to be real with themselves and with each other. And in a world that moved too fast and expected too much, that felt like the rarest kind of love. It started with a passing comment, Piper pointing at a quaint, ivy-covered building tucked between a florist and an old record shop. "That's the kind of place I dream about," she said wistfully. "Big window in front, garden out back, sunlight for days. Can't you just smell the cinnamon rolls from here?" Jax had simply nodded, sipping his coffee, pretending not to file every word away like it was a confidential deal memo. A few weeks later, he handed her an envelope. No ribbon, no dramatic flourish, just her name scribbled across the front in his slightly impatient handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Her name, Piper Sweet, printed at the top. Below it in neat legalese, proof of property ownership. She stared at it, then stared at him. "What is this?" He leaned casually against the cafe counter, like he wasn't turning her whole world upside down. "It's a little house," he said, "with a wide front window and a garden. I figured it might be the perfect place for a bakery." Piper's eyes welled instantly. "You bought it for me." "I didn't buy it for you," he replied with a smirk. "I invested in a very promising, if slightly chaotic, startup called Sweet Things by Piper." She let out a stunned laugh, half sob, half shock. "Jax, this is huge, this is." "I know." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "You always said dreams need space to grow. I just made sure you had the soil." She looked down at the deed, then back at him. "You're seriously okay with this?" He nodded. "It's the safest investment I've ever made. Low risk, high return, plus the CEO's adorable." Piper launched herself into his arms, laughing and crying all at once. And right then, right there, Jax knew. This wasn't charity and it wasn't business. It was love with powdered sugar on top. At first, Piper didn't even notice it happening. A little hesitation here, a nervous laugh there. A moment of silence when Jax talked about the future, as if she couldn't quite picture herself in the same frame. She still smiled, still kissed him goodbye, still baked his favorite muffins. But something in her had begun to pull back quietly, like a tide retreating before a storm. It wasn't the bakery. The building was perfect. The garden already had lavender sprouting. Her dreams were materializing right in front of her, thanks to Jack's. And maybe that was the problem. Late one night she stood alone inside the empty space, fingers running along the unfinished counter, and whispered aloud, "What if this isn't really mine? What if I'm just living inside his generosity?" That thought stuck to her like flour on damp hands. The more she tried to brush it off, the more it clung. So she started skipping their usual morning walks, avoided the soft questions in his eyes. She busied herself with paint samples, equipment orders, anything that let her keep moving without sitting still long enough to ask what she was so afraid of. Jax noticed, of course, but he didn't chase her. He didn't demand explanations or try to fix it with more gifts. Instead, every morning he showed up. He'd bring coffee, hers, always right, and sit on the front step of the unfinished bakery with 2 cups and no expectations. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he just stared at the passing cars, always waiting, never pushing. Until one morning, Piper finally stepped outside, apron wrinkled, eyes tired, holding a half-baked croissant in one hand and her heart in the other. "I don't want to be someone who just receives," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "I want to earn this, all of it, including you." Jax turned to her, no judgment in his face, only calm. "You already do, every damn day." And then he took the croissant from her hand, bit into it, and winced. "Still needs work, though." Piper burst out laughing, and just like that, the tide came back in. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning where the world felt half asleep, and the sunlight filtered in like a whisper. Piper arrived early at the bakery to prep for a small, soft-opening test run, only to find the front door already unlocked. She frowned. No one was supposed to be there. Pushing the door open, she stopped in her tracks. Jax was in the kitchen, wearing one of her spare aprons, hands absolutely covered in flour, elbows deep in a bowl of dough he was clearly struggling to control. "Are you baking?" she asked, half amused, half horrified. He glanced up, sheepish, dough stuck to his forearm, attempting to. "Why?" "I had a plan," he said, looking suspiciously at the lopsided blob he was shaping on a baking tray. "It made more sense in my head." She stepped closer, eyeing the wonky smiley face he'd tried to carve into the top of the dough. It looked more like a nervous emoji than a cookie. "This is objectively terrible," she said gently. "Accurate," he agreed, brushing flour onto his slacks with a grimace. "But I figured if I'm going to spend the rest of my life eating your baked goods, I should at least try to make one." Piper froze, smile fading into stillness. "Wait, what?" Jax reached behind him and pulled out a small ramekin. Nestled inside, surrounded by a sprinkle of sugar, was a ring, simple, classic, gleaming like it had been waiting for this kitchen all along. He stepped forward, voice steady but eyes soft. "I don't know how to make croissants, or cookies, or smiley faces that don't look like they've seen things." She let out a watery laugh. "But I do know that you is the best thing I've ever stumbled into, and I want to be part of your world. Flour, chaos, 5 a.m. alarms and all." Then, holding the ring out in his flour-dusted palm, "Piper sweet, will you marry me?" She blinked at him, completely undone, then grinned through the tears. "Only if I don't have to eat that thing you baked." He laughed, "Deal." And right there, surrounded by mismatched measuring cups and the scent of burnt sugar, she said yes. The garden behind the bakery had never looked more magical. String lights zigzagged overhead, glowing warm against the fatting afternoon sky. Wildflowers lined the wooden benches. The scent of vanilla, coffee, and fresh pastries floated through the air like a blessing. It wasn't a grand wedding, No ballroom, no chandeliers, but it was them. Simple, sweet, honest. Guests held mugs of piping hot coffee, brewed fresh from the machine Piper had once used every morning at the cozy mug. It had been a gift from the cafe's owner, now retired, who cried more than the bride's mother. The aisle was short, winding between flower beds and herb planters, leading to a small wooden arch covered in ivy and dried orange slices, Piper's quirky touch. And then there was Jack's. In a slate blue suit, hair slightly windswept, nerves fraying more with every minute. He'd already messed up 2 espresso shots, spilled oat milk on his pants, and oversteamed a latte twice. 10 coffees, his best man muttered with a smirk. You've made 10 and drunk none. I need something to do with my hands, Jax hissed. Why is waiting harder than mergers? But then the music shifted, and Piper stepped into the garden. She wore a simple white dress that fluttered in the breeze, elegant, effortless. Along the hem and sleeves, tiny hand-stitched smiley face cookies peeked through the lace, subtle and silly and perfectly hers. Jax forgot how to breathe. She walked down the aisle barefoot, holding a bouquet made of lavender and cinnamon sticks. Her eyes locked onto his, and every noise, every flutter of nerves disappeared into stillness. When they said their vows, Piper's voice trembled as she whispered, I thought you were just a customer. Then I thought you were a miracle, but you're both, and somehow you're mine. Jack smiled, really smiled, and replied, You gave me a home in a place I never expected, right beside you, in a bakery full of chaos, sugar, and love. They kissed under the ivy arch as the crowd cheered, and a cookie bouquet was tossed into the air. It wasn't just a wedding. It was the full-circle ending of something that had started with a lopsided cookie and a black coffee, and the beginning of something even sweeter. Every morning, before the city fully stirred, the little bakery on the corner lit up with the golden glow of ovens warming and laughter drifting from the kitchen. Piper, still in her flour-dusted apron and mismatched socks, bustled around like always, burning one tray, underbaking another, talking to her sourdough starter like it was a grumpy roommate. She hadn't magically become less clumsy or more organized. The truth was, she was still beautifully chaotic. But now there was a hand that always reached out to steady the tray when she tripped, a voice that gently reminded her to breathe when she panicked over a collapsed meringue, and a man sitting at the corner table by the window every single morning, waiting with a smile, a laptop, and 2 cups of coffee. Jack still wore suits, still ran a company, still had days filled with calls and contracts and boardroom tension. But every day began the same way, at the little bakery that bore Piper's name, with the smell of cinnamon in the air and the woman he loved wiping sugar off his tie. He never stopped being the sharp CEO, and she never stopped being the dreamy baker. But together they were something stronger, quiet, steady, unshakable. Not loud, not perfect. Just 2 people who had chosen each other, again and again, in the smallest, softest moments. And in the little garden out back, beside the sun-warmed tables and the lavender bushes Piper talked to when she thought no one was listening, there was a wooden sign that said, Sweet things baked with love, built to last.